Hello rocket makers! One of the big issues I'm facing with my Saturn V build is attaching the 3D printed plastic to the blue tube. It slides over, gets glued into place. So the obvious question is, what's the most suitable adhesive? And that's what we're going to answer today. So stay tuned. Quick note from the editor. Often during this video, I say white glue. I started using white glue when I was 10 years old, and yeah, I really haven't used it since. I use wood glue. So anytime you hear me say white glue, I mean wood glue. Secondly, you may notice that the sound goes out intermittently as I use percussive impact on my test pieces. Yes, I did in fact take a hammer to my test pieces. So, good video. So let's start at the outset by admitting that I don't know what the best adhesive is. There are a few that we're going to use. One of the obvious ones is CA glue, cyanoacrylate. It's a pretty standard glue. Now I'm using a medium here today because as I slide the plastic over the blue tube, there's still enough wiggle there that you want something that can fill those gaps. Now my main concern with CA glue is the working time. So for example, if I have a section that's covered in CA glue and I start to slide it on, does it stick part way on or does it go all the way? Now another concern with CA glue is it's a very brittle bond. I've had parts come off of rockets before with CA glue. In my mind, CA glue is really only the best adhesive for gluing fingers. It's never my go-to adhesive. It's not one I really trust a lot. So I want to make sure I can trust it here. So in addition to getting the part in place, after it's had appropriate time to cure, I'm going to test to see, for example, is it going to come off easily or any other issues that I might have. The next adhesive I'm going to look at is Gorilla Glue. Now this is going to work a little bit differently. I'm not sure how well it bonds to plastic, but one of the things Gorilla does is it expands as it cures. So what I'm hoping is going to happen is we get a coat of Gorilla Glue on the body tube, and as it expands, it's basically going to clamp that glue into place. Now if it does that successfully, I can reinforce it with a few dabs of CA glue, just to make sure it doesn't move laterally or anything like that. But I'm actually pretty optimistic about the Gorilla Glue. It's not something I've worked with a lot in the past though, so we'll see how that goes. And the third glue I'm going to try, using the same principle, I know it's not going to stick to the plastic very well, but again, if it gets on the body tube and expands enough that it can just basically clamp that in place, again with a couple of dabs of CA glue as reinforcement, it may work sufficiently. This is nice and cheap and readily available. Now the blue tube itself, I'm experimenting with a smaller tube. The problem I have here in Canada is if you look at the list price of blue tube on their website, factor in exchange rates and shipping costs, it costs me 2 to 2.5 times the list price of the tube on their website to get it in my hands. So I'm going to be starting with a still expensive but much less expensive size. This is the 54 millimeter, the spare I had from making the motor mount. And again, I want to do this before I start trying it on the big tube where I'm using the final pieces, and that's a very expensive tube. Okay, so let's start with the CA glue. Now, usually when I glue, I like to have a layer of wax paper down. So that way, if the glue drips, it doesn't ruin the surface. And if something sticks to it, the wax paper is fairly easy to sand off. But a lot of glues, white glue for example, you can just peel it off the wax paper pretty easily. So I'm starting there. Now I'm going to start with the CA glue. So I'm using just a medium thickness CA glue. So it does have some gap filling properties. I'm going to do just a few dabs on the end first, and then try sliding it on just to gauge my work time. And that way, if I don't have sufficient work time, I'm not ruining the whole tube, I'm just ruining a section. Okay, so let's start with that. So I'm just going to put some evenly spaced drops all around the tube. Now bear in mind the actual body part I'm putting on here is about you know, 12 to 15 centimeters long. So I mean, that's actually more than that centimeters. So you can see that this, even with a medium glue, it's may not be that good a candidate. So let's try a little bit more medium glue, being a little more generous here. So the work time seems okay. The issue I'm having is just the gaps. I don't know if this is going to be a sufficient gap filler. It's not going to bond evenly all around, but I'll let that sit for a few hours and perhaps try filling the edges after it's had some time to set. Okay, so it's definitely going to bond more on one side than the other. So that's the first drawback of this method. So let's give that a few hours and then we can come back and have a look. Okay, so back after a couple hours, let the thing settle a bit. To my surprise, it actually did glue into space fairly well. The medium CA glue did actually fill the gaps as it should, and it's feeling pretty solid. Now I'm going to let this dry overnight before doing any impact tests. So at this point, I'm just going to move on to the next adhesive and the next piece of plastic. So next up, we have the Gorilla Glue. Now, the theory here is this stuff expands 2 to 3 times its size. So I'm just going to coat a section of the tube, put the plastic over it, and let it expand until it basically grips it like a clamp from inside. Now, as I've mentioned, I've never used this before, so I just reread the directions and I'm going to give it a go. So I'm going to mark off a section of the tube to glue, and I'm going to leave a little bit of space in between the 2 sections. Now this stuff does not want to come out. Okay, so first impressions, definitely difficult to work with. Now, a note on personal protective equipment. I know these gloves are very much in demand right now, so I'm trying to be very careful about how I use them, because even if I could replace them, which is not a given at the moment, I wouldn't want to, because I want them to go to the people who need them during this crisis. So I am trying to be very careful about my use of gloves. But by the same token, this is a skin irritant. You do need something on your hands while working with this glue. Getting it out of the bottle proved more of a challenge than I expected. It's a very thick liquid, and just spreading it on was a very difficult process. But yeah, so we'll give that a couple hours to set, and we'll come back and see how it looks. Okay, so it's the next day. I have cheated and had a look, but here's what we have. So, I mean, that's on there good and solid. You can see it actually expanded out the side. So that's certainly something we'd have to watch for in assembly, but certainly on the other side it's nice and clean. So I'm guessing we would want to do away from the edges, not quite all the way. But it does expand quite a bit. It definitely fills the gaps and it definitely clamps it in place. So the last one we want to look at is just some regular wood glue. Okay, so nothing fancy. This comes in many brands, but it's all basically the same sort of stuff and it works quite well. Okay, so I have one more section, which I'm going to use for this. And while I think about it, I'm actually going to label my pieces. So we have CA, Gorilla, and wood glue. Now, I'm not too optimistic about the wood glue, but yeah, I'm already surprised by a few things. So again, I'll mark off a section. For this stuff, you don't need any PPE because it's just straight good old-fashioned wood glue. And I do want a good generous coating here because I do want it to hopefully swell up and clamp it in place in a very similar fashion to what the Gorilla Glue did. And clean it up a little bit. Okay. So that's the last section in place. What I'm going to do is let this cure overnight. And tomorrow I'm going to start giving it some escalating levels of abuse to see where I can make these things fail. And from that, I'll conclude what sort of glue I'm going to go for. Some interesting results. I have the three sections with the white glue, the Gorilla Glue, and the CA. Now, after giving it just some very basic abuse, honestly, all three seem to perform well. The white glue does have a little bit of movement in there after the hammering, but it's still on there quite securely. The Gorilla Glue had the leaks around the edge. But honestly, any one of them will work. So which one am I going to go with? Well, there are some advantages and disadvantages to each. The woodworking glue is the easiest to work with and probably the least expensive. The Gorilla Glue is a skin irritant, a bit of a pain to work with, and you do have this issue with leaking around the ends. It's definitely expensive to be using in the volume that I will need. The CA glue worked a lot better than I expected, to be honest, but there are still some issues. There is the potential of short work time where you just don't get the part in place before the glue sets. So that to me is the greatest fear. So based on what I'm seeing here, I am thinking that perhaps white glue in combination with CA glue. So a little bit of CA glue around the edges and a white glue in the middle, and this should hold pretty solid. The Gorilla Glue, honestly, just it's too difficult to work with. It's just, yeah, in the volumes we're going to be using, it's just not something that I want to be dealing with. And again, it's the most expensive option, so I'm going to be going with white glue and CA glue around the edges. Okay, so that concludes my glue experiments. I now know what I'm going to be using, white glue with some CA glue around the edges. I've done a relatively inexpensive experiment before committing to the final product. I know I have enough product on hand to do all that is required, and I'm good to start assembling pieces. So stay tuned, more excitement to come.